Halo, thank you semuanya yang udah datang di sesi ACE Tutoring kali ini untuk mata kuliah Introductory Microeconomics with Bayuajie. Recording dan material sana nanti akan kita share setelah kelas selesai. Untuk Aji, silahkan dimulai.
Halo semua, kelihatan nggak?
Kelihatan, Ji.
Alright. Good evening, everyone. My name is Aji. I am taking economics from the class of 2019. Thank you all for coming and hope y'all are having a great day. So here we go. Introductory Microeconomics in a nutshell, hopefully. You will go out of this class knowing more and understanding more about the topic than you previously have before. All right, so first of all, economics, why? Or I think the more appropriate question would be what? What is economics? So economics is, I like to look at it as a study of choices, right? And why do we need to make these choices is because, well, humans are essentially greedy and we have unlimited wants and needs. Meanwhile, the resources that we have on this planet is limited and are scarce. So economics is the study of choices. So these limited resources would be distributed as efficiently as possible. So the official definition of economics is the social science that studies how people interact with things of value. In particular, the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Economics focuses on the behavior and interaction of economic agents and how economies work. So by making these choices, there is a thing called a trade-off. So what is a trade-off? So let me just give you an example. For example, you want to have breakfast and you should choose between having eggs or bread, right? So by choosing egg, the trade-off that you make is you don't eat the bread, you eat the egg. So yeah, that is the trade-off in that choice. There's also this thing called opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost of you choosing that egg is the bread. So opportunity cost is the value of something when a particular course of action is chosen. And a trade-off is any situation where making one choice means losing something else. In this case, the egg and the bread. All right, moving on. The basic economics problem. What, how, and who. More specifically, what to produce, how to produce them, and whom to produce it for. So all of these problems relate to the allocation of resources. And as we know, those resources are scarce. And these resources are split into four different things: the factors of production, which are land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Yeah. This is something that you must consider, that you will need to consider throughout your journey in studying economics. The law of supply and the law of demand. Everything relates to these two, right? So first of all, what is supply and what is demand, right? So supply, the official definition, is the willingness and ability of a producer to produce a quantity of a good or service at a certain price. So it's looking at things from a producer point of view. The demand is the willingness and ability of a consumer to purchase a quantity of a good or service at a certain price in a given period of time. So it is looking at things from the consumer's point of view. Bear in mind, in economics, we don't use the words customers, instead we use consumers. That's a little thing to consider. So moving on, what is the law of supply and what is the law of demand? Law of supply states that when the price of a certain good increases, the quantity supplied will decrease and vice versa, ceteris paribus. The law of demand states that as the price of a good increases, the quantity demanded will decrease and vice versa, ceteris paribus. Now, why did I say ceteris paribus? It is a pretentious Latin phrase meaning all other things equal. Because as you will soon learn, price is not the only thing that determines the demand or the supply of a certain good or service. But to make things simpler and to make things easier to understand, we use ceteris paribus, so we only consider the price. Moving on to assumptions. Now, in economics, we use assumptions because we cannot know for sure every single factor that goes into consideration when making a choice, right? And there are billions of people around the world, so we don't know the trillions of factors that goes into consideration when making a choice. So there must be assumptions that are taken into consideration when stating something or when solving a problem. So the basic economic assumptions are, there are quite a few, and when we look at certain topics or ideas, there might be assumptions that are specifically used for that. Anyway, the basic economic assumptions are that human beings are rational decision makers. Firms want to maximize profit while individuals want to maximize utility. And also, people act independently on the basis of full and relevant information. All right, so those are just the four, I think four, yeah, basic economic assumptions. Okay, so what is positive economics? What is normative economics? That is a picture of John Maynard Keynes, which is one of the big daddies of economics back in the 20th century. Yeah. So positive economics is a branch of economics that concerns the description and explanation, but then again, both of them, yeah. Anyway, positive economics deals with facts, right? I think you'll be also learning positive and normative statements in your English classes. So yeah, positive economics is based on facts, right? Numbers, statistics, the cause of something. So it focuses on the cause and effect of certain things in economics. So it can be like the what is branch of economics. Meanwhile, normative economics deals with value and focuses on what things should be. So it's like, it's more open to interpretation. It's not set in stone, if that makes sense. So an example of positive economics is something like government provided healthcare increases public expenditures. So that can be tested, that can be proven as well. So healthcare that is provided by the government increases public expenditures. Well, that is just facts because government expenditures is a part of public spending. And therefore, healthcare that is provided by the government is part of public expenditures, which means that it increases public expenditures. Yeah, that is a statement-based fact. Statement, yeah. So it has no value judgment attached to it. So it can be proven or disproven by studying the relation between government expenditures and, government provided healthcare and also public expenditures. On the other hand, normative economics, so a statement for normative economics can be something like the government should provide healthcare for all citizens. Now that is not that can't be proven or disproven. That is not fact based. So it's open to interpretation. You can agree with it. You might not agree with it. It's value based. So it's rooted in personal perspective. So it deals with what should be done instead of what has been done. Right, moving on. The production possibility frontier or curve. Yeah, it shows the relationship, or no, it shows the maximum combination of two goods being produced at the same time in the same economy in a given period of time. So, for example, here I took this off Google. It is the relationship. It is the PPF for fidget spinners and basketball. So, any point that is touching the curve itself means that the resources used for making these two goods are being used efficiently. Meanwhile, if it doesn't touch the curve, so if it's below the curve, like that point where fidget spinners equals to 1 and basketball equals to 6, the resources aren't being used efficiently. So that could be pushed upwards. Now a curve outside, a point outside of the curve would be impossible, because the curve shows the production possibility, which means anything outside of that is impossible. Okay, so there could be ways to increase the PPF to make that impossible point possible, right? So an outward shift of the PPF. Now, that is possible if there's an improvement in the input or the factors of production. So that could be either quantity-wise or quality-wise. For example, this curve is when there's 1 unit of labor being used. So that curve is a maximum possible combination when only 1 labor is being used. When 2 labor is being used, for example, maybe that impossible point becomes possible. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. There could be also factors in which and when the PPC actually curves inwards or moves to the left, and that is mostly related to supply shocks like natural disasters or war, so the factors of production decreases. Next up is the indifference curve, or measuring utility. Now, it's hard, isn't it, economics, to interpret utility, your satisfaction to consume something. When economics, somehow that is turned into numbers. Now, indifference means that you're indifferent when you're consuming good Y, a combination of good Y and good X. So, for example, in point A and point B, you are indifferent to it. So by consuming Y1 and X1, or Y2 and X2 in point B, you're indifferent to it. Your total level of satisfaction stays the same. Now, if you want more utility, and we come into this theory with the assumption that individual wants to maximize their utility, then there could be an outward shift in the indifference curve, which is represented by U2 and also U3. So yeah, it is a combination of good Y and good X, and your total level of satisfaction when consuming those goods. Problem 1. Okay, this was taken from last year's exam, which I did. So I advise you to do this problem quickly. I mean, problem 1 quickly, because it's only like explaining the basic understanding of each concept, right? So scarcity, choice, trade-off, opportunity, cost. So due to scarcity, we need to make choices, and that leads to trade-offs and opportunity costs. Of course, don't just write that, explain that in more detail, but not too much, because you're not gonna have enough time if you explain scarcity, choice, trade-off, and opportunity cost in a great level of detail. Positive and normative economics. Just state what positive economics is, what normative economics is, and provide one example for each. The PPF, just draw the PPF of good Y and good X, or you could name it anything, and explain that it's the maximum combination of goods and services that can be produced in the economy in a given period of time. Economics is the study of choices. Microeconomics deals with individual firms and consumers, while macroeconomics, which you will learn later in semester 2, is looking at the overall aggregate demand and aggregate supply of nations. The 4 properties of the indifference curve are 1, they do not cross, so a higher level of satisfaction will result in a different curve. They slope downward, and they also are drawn as a convex to the origin. And lastly, a higher indifference curve. A higher indifference curve means higher satisfaction. So U3 is a higher level of satisfaction than U2, and U2 is a higher level of satisfaction to U1. So far, are there any questions?
Enggak, Kak.
All right. Moving on. Determinants of supply and demand. So, as I've said previously, price is not the only thing that determines the supply or the demand of a good or a service. So, there are a few factors. There are a few factors that determines the shift in the supply curve or a shift in the demand curve. So first of all, the supply. Looking at things from the producer's point of view, it always relates to the cost in making a certain good, right? So a change in the cost of the factors of production, any one of them will result in a shift in the supply curve. If the cost of the factors of production goes up, then the supply curve will shift to the left, and vice versa. The state of technology. New technology can also be a determinant of the supply curve shifting. So if there is new technology that could improve productivity of any factors of production, then it will shift the supply curve to the right, and also vice versa. Additionally, another thing that could affect the supply curve is government intervention. So if a government implements a policy, for example, a minimum wage policy that could increase the cost of production, then it would result in the supply curve shifting to the left, and vice versa. So yeah, so those are three things that could be a factor in shifting the supply curve. So the costs of factor of production, technology, and also government intervention. For the demand side of things, we look at the consumers. So we look at their buying power, their ability to purchase goods or services. So we look at their income. That's a thing that could shift the demand curve. When consumers have higher income, then the demand curve will shift to the right, and vice versa. Also, price of other goods could affect the demand curve. What I mean by this is substitute goods, which we will touch on later. If, for example, actually, I'll explain that later on. Yeah, the price of other goods could also affect the demand of the good. Also, the taste of the consumers could affect the demand curve. Or like, if it's a seasonal good, for example, you live in a country where there are 4 seasons, so the demand for jackets would increase in the winter time and decrease in the summertime. Yeah. Other factors that could also lead to a shift in the demand curve should be things such as the size of population, income distribution, which could also be determined by government intervention. And as I've said previously, seasonal changes. Equilibrium. It's when demand equals the supply. So it's when things are hopefully as efficient as they are, as efficient as it could be. So, and also another thing to consider is that equilibrium is self-correcting in a way, because if the producers set a price of a certain good too high, then no one will buy it. Or if a producer sets a price of a good too low, then a lot of people will buy it, then they wouldn't have enough good to provide to the consumers, which is called excess demand. So it's self-correcting. So the equilibrium will correct itself by magic. So if a firm tries to raise its price, there will be excess supply. If it's too low, then there will be excess demand, and so on. So there will always be an equilibrium, which is scary, but it's not, because it's economics. All right, problem 2. The development of digital technology has affected the competition between hard copy books, which are sold offline, that should be one word, through bookstores, books, and ebooks, which are sold online through internets. There's no such thing as the internets. Flipping heck. Okay, so list the determinants of both the demand and the supply and describe them briefly. Briefly, briefly. Yeah, so as I've said before, price is number one. Other things to consider: the income, the taste, the price of other substitute goods from the supply side of things, the cost of production, the state of new technology, and also government intervention. All right, I'm going to turn on my camera now and draw curves. What's up? All right. Is this clear enough? All right, cool. So this is the market for ebooks. We start off at E1, equilibrium 1, S1, supply curve number 1, and also D1, demand curve number 1. All right, so the x-axis always is for quantity, and the y-axis is always for price. Yeah, this is something that you will see whenever you're learning economics. So yeah, what's the first case? The decrease in the price of hard copy books, right? So as I've said previously, one of the determinants of the demand for a certain good can be dependent on the demand of its substitute good. So when there's a decrease in the price of hard copy books, which is a substitute for ebooks, then the demand for ebooks will decrease. How do you illustrate that? So a decrease in the demand curve. So a shift in the demand curve to the left. Wash D2, right? What that means is the consumers wants less of ebooks, and therefore the producers can adjust to this decreasing level of demand by adjusting their price to be lower. This is my brother's table, by the way, behind me. Anyway, so yeah, there will be a new equilibrium. As I've said before, it's self-correcting, which is scary, but it's not because it's economics. Anyway, yeah, so that's question 2B. Yeah, that's question 2B. For question 2C, it's the decrease in the price of ebook. Right. Decrease in the price of ebooks. So you look at that first. So we start with the P. Instead of the D, like we start off in the previous part of the question, we start off with the P. Decrease in the price of ebooks. What will that cause? It will cause a case where, is it clear enough? Where the quantity demanded, where the point of D touches, the P touches the D, is higher than the quantity supplied, where the P meets the S. This part is excess demand, right? So how do you correct an excess demand? The producers will then produce more good at that price because they are the price setters, they determine the price, right? So there will be a shift in the supply curve to the right. That's how you illustrate it. That becomes Q2. The quantity overall will be higher. And yeah, that's for question 2C. Yeah, there will be a new equilibrium over there too. Okay, for the last part of this question is when both things happen at the same time. So first of all, there will be a decrease in the price of hard copy books, which means that there will be an increased demand in the substitute good, and also there will be a decrease in the price of ebook. So what happens then? So first of all, because the initial thing that's happened is there is a decrease in the price of hard copy books, which means that the demand curve of the ebooks will shift to the left, like in question 2B. But also, there will be a decrease in the price of ebook, which means that the suppliers will want to supply the good at that price, which means that there will be a shift in the supply curve to the right as well. So D1 goes to D2, S1 goes to S2. There will be a new equilibrium. Let's just call it QE and PE. So that is what will happen if the two things are happening at the same time. Remember, the market will always correct itself. So there will be an equilibrium. All right, any questions?
Ji, lightning lo berubah-ubah.
Kelihatan nggak?
Yuk geser lagi. Coba kayak agak ditegakin gitu deh.
Ini siapa sih yang ngomong?
Gue Bella.
Oh.
Udah. Lanjut Aji.
Right. Moving on. Yeah, that's problem 2. Over the years, problem 1 have been about like basic concepts and explaining them briefly. Problem 2 have been about like basic market equilibrium. Problem 3 has been about like elasticity. And also, and question 4 has been about budget constraint. And question 5 have been about functions of production. Okay. Moving on. What is the law of diminishing marginal utility? Let's just, I'm just going to provide an example. If you eat pizza, 1 slice is good, right? 2 slices is great. 3 slices, you might have a little bit too much there. And by the 4th and 5th slice, you will just be feeling full. and you will not enjoy that pizza, right? So that is the law of diminishing marginal utility. It is when as the consumption of a good rises, it doesn't necessarily mean that the utility will increase. Instead, it's the other way around. Like there will be a tipping point in where the utility will decrease as consumption increases. Yeah. Moving on to elasticity. Okay. So what is elasticity? It is a measure of responsiveness, of how much something changes when there's a change in one of the factors that determines it. In this case, we will I will explain about, we will look into PEDs, which is the price elasticity of demand. So it's how much demand changes when the price changes. So it's a measure of how much the quantity demanded of the good changes when there is a change in price. There you go. That's the definition of PED. Okay. When PED is bigger than 1, that means that it's elastic. When it's smaller than 1, it means that it's inelastic. If it's equal to 1, then it's unitary elastic. If it's equals to 0, it's perfectly inelastic. If it's equal to infinity, then that will mean that it's perfectly elastic. Okay. If PED is elastic, then the total revenue can be increased. This is looking at it from a producer's point of view. Can be increased by lowering the price of the product. If PED is inelastic, then the total revenue can be raised by increasing the price of the product. If the PD is already equals to 1, then the total revenue is already being maximized. Okay. So there are determinants of the PD as well. It's similar to the demand determinants because it's closely related. So number 1, the number and closeness of substitutes. The more substitute of a certain good, the more elastic the demand will be for that good. And vice versa, if it has less substitutes, then it will be more inelastic. Also, if it's a necessity, or if it's a primary good, it will be more inelastic because you need it. And vice versa, if it's less necessary to have it, then it will be more elastic. So elastic goods are usually primary goods, which you don't actually need. So if the price of that certain good is way too high, then not a lot of people will buy it. I see not a lot of people because some people still actually buy it, as you would probably know. And as I've said before, primary goods or necessity goods or goods that are necessary for living, like water, will be inelastic. You will have to buy water no matter what because you need it to live. Unitary goods, like unitarily elastic goods, or normal goods, which we will get into later on. And Perfectly inelastic goods could be like land, because there's a limited amount of land on this planet. So whatever the price is, if you want that land in that particular spot, you will have to pay whatever the price is. A perfectly elastic good is something that's in the perfectly in the perfect competition market, which there are so many or even an infinite amount of substitutes that when that good, the price of that good increases, then no one will buy it. All right. So this is the formula. PD equals to delta QD over delta P. Yeah, that's it really. Like, yeah, that's it. It's like the question won't be that hard. I don't think so. It has been pretty basic and simple throughout recent years, so there's no need to go beyond that first line. So PD equals to the change in percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do this in the whiteboard again. All right. So first of all, the question being asked is the PD, right? So A P PD equals, it's actually given the percentage change in quantity demanded is 3%. So it's minus, minus 3%. And the percentage change in quantity demanded is also given, which is 10%. Which is equals to minus 0.3. In elasticity, we only look at the absolute value, so we ignore the minus sign. But then again, 0.3 is smaller than 1, so therefore it means that the good is inelastic. In this case, I think it's cigarettes. Okay, so B. What was the question? I think it's the price, right? I've done this prior to today and I forgot the question. I'm sorry. I think it's the price. So we need to look at the percentage change in price, right? Which is equals to P2 minus P1 over P1 times 100, which is equals to P2 minus 20,000 over 20,000 times 100, right? And if we just cross that out, then it's P2 minus 20,000 over 200. Yes, okay, so then we put that into the PD formula, which is percentage QD, QD, P equals to minus 60 over minus 0.3 from there equals to 200, right? Okay, because that's P1. Okay, then P2, we'll put it in that formula again. Minus 20,000 over 200 equals to 200. Right. With algebra, or if you have the GDC calculator, you can put this into solver, and we can then find that P2 is equals to 60,000, right? Yeah. Is this in dollars? I think it's in rupiah. Yeah, I forgot. Right. So yeah, you just put it in the formula. This is pretty simple. Basic algebra, basic mathematics. I don't think that anyone is going to have a very difficult time with it. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Moving on. Yeah, it's in rupiah. So C, give your opinion whether teenagers have an elastic or inelastic price elasticity of demand. We can actually answer this based on our answer for part A. And that answer is inelastic because, well, the decrease in consumption is always of a smaller proportion to the increase in price. So when price goes up, quantity demanded does go down, but not to the extent of the price. And 0.3, you can like explain from the results that you get from part A that PED is smaller than 1, which means that it's inelastic. D, the KPAE is one of the proponents for the cigarette price increase, arguing that it will help protect the teenagers from the dangerous impacts of smoking. Do you think the argument is plausible? Explain your answer. Okay. Due to the fact that we have said that the price elasticity of demand for cigarettes for teenagers is inelastic, then increasing price might not be the best option or the best policy to decreasing the consumption of cigarettes for teenagers, because the demand is inelastic. So it might not be an efficient way to decrease teenage smokers. There would be other way to decrease it, but you don't need to explain that because that doesn't relate to the question, the problem in of itself. Okay. When are we having a break for Salat? Because I think this is a good time. Studef.
Boleh, Ji?
Alright. Sampai jam berapa ya?
Sampai 18:05 kali ya.
Alright.
Oke. Oke, waktu break-nya udah selesai. Untuk Aji, boleh dimulai lagi, Ji.
Okay. Okay, up until this point, are there any questions? Okay, so moving on to the next topic is budget constraint. So basically, simply put, this is the budget that you have in consuming two different goods because we want to keep it as simple as possible. So at this moment in time, it is only looking at the consumption of two goods. So yeah, that's it really. Normal goods. So a normal good is a good that you usually consume when you have a sufficient budget. So for example, it could be something like bread, like the bare necessities of something, right? And normal good has an elastic relationship between income and the demand for the good itself. So when there's an increase in the income, there will also be an increase in the demand for the normal good and vice versa. So it's positively correlated with income. When you have more income, you can then consume more normal goods. The substitution effect. Well, we touched on this earlier. So it's looking at two similar goods. For example, chicken and beef, right? So those are an example of substitute goods. So you can either consume chicken or you can consume beef. So for example, if the price of beef is lower, then you would prefer to consume beef. And vice versa, if the price of chicken is lower, then you would prefer to consume chicken. So that's the substitution effects. So consumers tend to switch to cheaper alternatives when the price of a good rises. This could be affected by many things such as branding. So if you like a particular brand, then you would prefer to buy that instead of something that's something that you don't prefer, and that relates to taste as well, and it's one of the determinants of the demand. So in general, when the price of a product increases, then you would switch to the substitute. This is assuming that your income stays the same. Relating to that, the income effect. When you have more disposable income, or if you have more income in general, then you can buy more things, simply put that way. When you have more money, you can buy more things. Because it has a positive correlation with normal goods, people tend to buy more normal goods, but then again, that's not everyone, and some might choose to buy more expensive goods that they have previously not bought because they don't have the purchasing power when they had a lower income. So in general, when you have more income, then you purchase more goods, basically. Right, so problem number 4. Dante, who recently graduated from the Faculty of Economics and Business at Universitas Indonesia, currently works at one of the top economic and business consulting firms in Jakarta. Wow. As a fresh graduate, Dante receives a starting monthly salary of 6 million. Suppose that Dante's current consumption bundles consist of 2 items, which I've said previously. We want to make things as simple as possible for now. So only 2 goods that Dante is consuming: drinks, which is 20,000 per bottle, and food, which is 30,000 per portion. Okay, so consider that food and drinks are normal goods for Dante. So the demand is elastic. So the budget constraint. Whiteboard time. Okay. We also need to find the equation, slope of the budget constraint, and illustrate that. Food on the x-axis. Okay. Whiteboard is back. Okay. Cool. So, equation for budget constraint. It's y equals to mx plus c. Income, which is, we'll write things down first. Income. So total income is used to buy food and drinks, right? So food, Q stands for quantity, plus Q drinks, right? Yes. 6 million equals to 30,000 F plus 20,000 D. That's the equation. To make things simpler, just remove the zeros. 600 equals to 3F plus 2D. That's the equation. We need to find the slope. Follow this. D equals to minus 3 over 2F plus C. C being constant. And that's the slope. So the slope is equals to minus 3 over 2. That's the slope. That's the equation. Maths. Right, so the income is given. The price of food is given. The price of drinks is also given. So simplify that. 600 is equals to 3F plus 2D. How do we illustrate this? The question wants us to put the food in the x-axis. That means this is for drinks. You have to find the y and x intercept by inserting 0, which is when it touches the y and x axis respectively, into the equation, which is 600 equals 3F plus 2D. It will be around 200 for food and 250 plus for the drink. So it will look something like that. And that's it. That's for the part A. Part B, it's given that the equilibrium quantity for food is 100, and the equilibrium quantity for drinks is 150. When you put this into the equation, it can be seen that these two values actually touches the budget line, the budget constraint. So it will be 100 here, around 150 there. So that is point A, because the question wants us to label that equilibrium point A. So the question also wants us to explain why this is optimal. This is an optimal point because it touches the budget line. So this is a point where the resources that Dante has, which is his income, is used efficiently and at the very maximum point, right? So it's maximizing utility, which is the very first assumption that we consider when looking at things from the consumer point of view. So when food is equal to 100 and the drinks are equal to 150, it is at an optimal point because it touches the budget line. If it falls below the budget line, for example, if it's here, point B, if it's here, then it doesn't touch the budget line, which means that it's not an optimal point for Dante to have, because he's not using his money efficiently, and therefore he's not maximizing his utility. And everyone wants to maximize their utility when purchasing something. So that is not the place to go for Dante. Okay, moving on. Next question is, there is a long drought that has incited the increase in the price of food to 40,000 per portion. Right, the equation of Dante's new budget constraint. Count the slope. All right. So I need to try it again. Okay, never mind. So the initial equation is 600 equals to 3f plus 2d, right, when simplified. So that's equation A. Equation C is 600 equals to 4f now, because the price of food increases, plus 2d, because it stayed the same. So the slope would be, following again, y equals mx plus c, d equals to minus 2f plus c. All right, so the slope is equals to minus 2. That's the slope. Right, so we need to find another point. Oh, excuse me, I was wrong in that. Here, this is supposed to be 150. And when we input, when we are searching for the new y and x intercept, this is equals to 200. So the new budget line will look like that, because the food becomes more expensive. That's it for this question, for this problem. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Any questions from that? I assume not. Okay, moving on. This is the final thing that will be discussed today. And that is it's about cost of production. So there are other assumptions that we need to consider here because it's looking at things from the producer's point of view, right? So what I've said initially, what I've said before is that producers or firms, in this case, it's the same thing, wants to maximize, they always want to maximize their profit, right? That's all they care about. That's the assumption. So for this part and for the questions relating to this topic, it's all about just memorizing the formulas, or in this case, because it's online, having the formula beside you so that you can just use it. So yeah, functions for production formula. Maybe a thing to consider is that there are two types of costs. One is explicit cost, and two is implicit cost. And explicit cost is like accounting profit, which only looks at the number value, so it only looks at the money side of things, while the implicit cost or the economic profit side of things looks at everything, which also and that looks at like the opportunity costs that the firms choose to not take, or also like the time that it takes to produce something that is considered for implicit costs. So the total cost is equals to explicit plus implicit costs. Okay, so functions for production, this is all you need, basically all you need. Okay, so from the revenue side of things, it's TR equals P times Q, total revenue equals price times quantity, average revenue equals total revenue over quantity, and if you enhance that formula, TR is equals to P times Q, so you just scratch out the Q, AR equals to P, MR, marginal revenue, is change in TR over change in Q. But if you get a function for the total revenue, you can then, it's basically the derivative of the total revenue. That is just another way to find marginal revenue. Okay, anyway, from the cost side of things, total cost equals total fixed cost plus total variable cost. It's also equals to the explicit plus implicit cost, but we can't really put a number on the implicit cost. That's why it's only that. Okay, so the average cost is the total cost over quantity, which is also equals to the average fixed cost over average variable cost. So you find that average variable cost equals fixed cost over Q, AVC equals VC over Q. Okay, I think it's pretty simple. I think. Okay. Anyway, last but not least, that should be MC. I apologize. That should be marginal cost instead of MR. So the marginal cost equals to change in total cost over change in quantity. A similar way to find it, like the marginal revenue, could also be if the TC is given as a function, then the MC is the derivative for the TC function. Okay. Other things to remember, and I think these are good things to note down, because you will need to interpret like the results that you get from the problem. So the firms make profit when the total revenue equals to total cost, the firms are losing money if the total revenue is bigger than the total cost. The break-even point is when, oh, I got that one wrong. Oh, sorry. The profit is when total revenue is bigger than total cost. I apologize. The break-even point is when the total revenue is equals to total cost. Uh, the firms are minimizing cost when average cost equals to marginal cost. The firms are maximizing profit if the marginal cost is equals to the marginal revenue, and the firm will achieve maximum revenue when MR, marginal revenue, is equals to 0. Okay. Next up, we have the law of diminishing marginal returns. It's pretty similar to the law of diminishing marginal utility, and where increasing a unit of input does not necessarily mean increasing unit of output. For the law of diminishing marginal utility, an increase in consumption does not necessarily mean an increase in utility. Here, it's pretty similar. Increase in an input of an input does not necessarily mean an increase in the unit of output. Okay, so for example, one labor produces 1 unit. 2 labor produces 3 units. 3 labor produces 4 units. So when going from 2 to 3 labor, it does not necessarily mean that increasing the labor will mean that the average product that they make is bigger. More input does not necessarily mean more output. There will be a tipping point in any factory, any business, where more does not necessarily mean better. Okay. It is actually related to the law of diminishing marginal utility. So there is an optimal point, but going beyond that is not worth it for the firm. Another thing to consider is the economies of scale. Now, this is when producing more equals better, but to a certain extent, right? It is when firms change their factors of production in order to increase the scale of output. For example, China have mastered economies of scale, and that's a completely factual thing to say because they have completely mastered this concept, right? They are able to produce a vast amount of products with such little price. So when a firm wants to specialize, or specialize, when a firm does specialization, if that makes sense, they will want to consider using the economies of scale, because if they're only producing one good, then it will be worth it to produce that good at such a high quantity, which means that it will cut their overall cost of production. Of course, there is a tipping point. Like I've said before, there will be a law of diminishing marginal returns, but with this case, it will be a lot. All right. So another example is McDonald's, where they have mastered economies of scale, but also have diversified their products. They are able to produce goods at a high rate while maintaining diversification. That's just an example. Oh, there are also these economies of scale uh, where uh, there are like increases in the long run average costs when a firm wants to alter their factors of production in order to increase the scale of output. So it's the tipping point of economies of scale. It's when factors of production aren't being used to its efficient or optimal level. So simply put, economies of scale is when the firm makes more product to decrease their cost of production. These economies of scale is when a firm fails to do that. Okay. The last question. It's actually a pretty long one, and I'm only going to explain the interpretation of things because it differs from year to year, but everything relates back to the formulas that I have given previously. So in this case, we need to find the marginal product, which is the change in output over change in workers or labor. Also, we need to find the total cost. We need to find the average total cost. We also need to find the marginal cost. Everything is based on the formula. And the pattern that can be seen by from the results is, or are, is that marginal product uh, actually increases at first, but decreases after a certain amount of workers, in this case, 3. And that could be related to the theory of the law of diminishing marginal returns, in where more unit of input does not necessarily mean more unit of output. Okay. The marginal cost also decreases at first, but increases after a certain amount of workers, in this case, 3. That also relates to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Also, the average total cost decreases at first, but increases after a certain number of workers, which is equals to 4 in this case, which means that it also relates to the the law of diminishing marginal utility. Okay. The average product of labor also increases at first, but it decreases after a certain amount of workers, in this case when it's equals to 3, which means that it also relates to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Some other things to interpret from the results that we can have after filling out the table, which is, I didn't put it here. It's just too much for me to put in one by one. It's not worth it because it changes every year. So other relationships is when you draw the table, when you draw the curve, you can then see when points start to increase or when it decreases or where they intersect. So for example, in this case, the marginal cost crosses the average total cost when it is at the very minimum point. Also, when marginal product increases, marginal cost decreases. Then, when marginal product starts to decrease, marginal cost starts to increase. So it's the little things that you should look out for in the graph. It's basically explaining the relationship, and that is just by looking at the intersections or when points starts to fall or starts to rise, and correlating them with each other. All right, that's it for me today. Some food for thought for you. The more you know, the more you know that you don't know. Thank you very much for coming, and good luck in your exams.
Makasih Aji.
Oke, thank you semuanya yang udah ikut sesi tutoring hari ini. Thank you Aji, thank you semua. Dan nanti recording dan material saya bakal di-share di grup angkatan ya. Thank you.